Burada. It's really lovely to see you. Smai, James Dewey. It's great to be here. It's great actually too that the slideshow that I've prepared as well, the PowerPoint, hopefully may work as well. It doesn't really matter if it doesn't. What I've got to say, I've got my notes here. Before we look at the passage today, which is John chapter 4, the kind of last few verses of a wonderful story of Jesus healing an official's son. It was up in the north in Galilee, played near Capernaum, between Capernaum and Cana, where Jesus performed his first miraculous sign in John's Gospel. Before we look at the story itself, a little bit of context for you in terms of John's Gospel. I think the journey into John's Gospel has been absolutely amazing. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to have favourite Gospels, but I've always been deeply challenged by John, and it's totally different than the other Gospels, the so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. John is out to do one thing. Why did John actually write his Gospel? Will the PowerPoint play? If we look at the first slide, we wonder why the Gospel writers wrote the Gospels that they did. John made it very clear later on in his Gospel, chapter 20, and this is what he wrote. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. John makes it very clear that he wrote the Gospel because he wanted people to know and understand who Jesus was. The word believe, one of John's favourite words in his Gospel is the word believe. It's mentioned 98 times in the Gospel. So believing, it's recognizing who Jesus was. And that's what John was really trying to portray. So there's many stories that he could have included that he didn't. The ones that he did include all pointed to the fact that Jesus was God and that by believing in him, you would have eternal life. Again, just a bit more before we read the Gospel reading for today in John chapter 4. Just to, again, a bit more background to why, really when John wrote the Gospel. The Gospels the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, were written probably around AD 60, Matthew and Luke a little bit later. John's Gospel apparently wasn't written till the end of the first century. So it was around 90 to 100 AD that John actually put together the writings and sayings that he had gathered over that period. And of course, by AD 90, Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension had all happened. And that was 60, if Jesus, that happened around AD 33, then there's a really big gap. We're not sure how many people were still alive at the time who were key witnesses, actually witnessed the life of Jesus for themselves. But John went about trying to organize his writing. And I think against this backdrop of belief, at his time, at the late first century, there was a lot of doubt over who Jesus was. A lot of conflicting ideas. There was what was called the Gnostic movement. They were a group of people who didn't really recognize Jesus' deity, but who were very much into trying to find out about God through their own efforts. Now, this was very prevalent at the time, and John, when he wrote his letters, referred a lot to false teachers. So John wrote at this backdrop. There was a lot of who was that man? There's so many kind of stories flying around. So John wanted to compose this gospel to clarify who he was. And the way he's written it's quite clever because in John, of course, there are groups of 7 things that happen, or groups of people. 7 is a holy number for the Hebrews. And so in John's Gospel, there are 7 I am sayings. I'm the way, the truth, the life. I'm the resurrection and the life. I'm the vine, you are the branches. So there were 7 I am sayings that were very powerful in pointing the signpost to who Jesus was. There were 7 witnesses, key witnesses. This sounds a bit like a trial, but it wasn't. There were 7 key witnesses that John refers to in his gospel. And there were 7 miracles. John actually refers to them as miraculous signs. And at the end of the passage we're going to read in a minute about the healing of the official's son, he refers to it as this second miraculous sign that Jesus performed in Galilee after leaving Judea in the south. Of course, the first miraculous sign was included in the song we've just been singing, the wedding at Cana, when he turned water into wine. And so this is the second of those signs. And our reading today falls very much into that group. So in the context of today's reading, Jesus, just a little bit about what he was doing previously. He started his ministry in John's Gospel up in the north. And that's where the first miraculous sign of the water into wine. And he went down to Judea, it was quite a long way, 100 miles, and to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem, in Judea, where John records he met Nicodemus. He performed some miraculous signs, and he caused a bit of a rumpus with the teachers of the law. He got a bit cross in the temple. So even that early interaction of Jesus in Judea, he had now headed back north again, right back into Galilee, way back in the far north. And he passed through Samaria. And of course, we've heard about the woman at Sychar, Mount Gerizim, the woman at the well. We've also looked at that story as well. So we find ourselves now, Jesus is back in Galilee. He's back in Cana, and he's leaving Cana on a journey, and he's intercepted by an official. Let's hear the story. So Leslie and Clive will come out and read them the story. It's John chapter 4. If you have your own Bibles, it's 43 to 54. So let's hear the readings.
Evangelical Ioan, y 4 bennod, dechrau gyda'r 44 adnod. Roedd Iesu wedi bod yn dweud fod dim parch at broffwyd yn yr ardal lle cafodd ei fagu. Ond pan gyrhaeddodd Galilea, cafodd groeso brwd gan y bobl oedd wedi bod yn Jerusalem dros wyl y Pasg, a gweld y cwbl roedd ei wedi wneud yno. Aeth yn ôl i bentref Cana, lle roedd wedi troi'r dŵr yn win. Clywodd un o'r swyddogion Llywodraeth Herod yn Capernaum fod Iesu wedi dod yn ôl o Judea i Galilea. Roedd mab y dyn mor sâl roedd ar fin marw. Felly aeth i Cana i chwilio am Iesu ac ymbil arno i fynd i lawr i achau y fab. Dwedodd Iesu, heb gael gweld arwyddion a gwirthiau rhyfeddol, newch chi bobl byth gredu. Ond syr, fydde'r swyddog wrtho, tyr gyda mi, cyn i'n plentyn bach i farw. Dos di, medde Iesu wrtho, mae dy fab yn mynd i fyw. Dyma'r dyn yn credu beth wedodd Iesu a mynd. Tra oedd ar ei ffordd adre, daeth ei weision i'w gyfarfod gyda'i newyddion fod y bachgen yn mynd i fyw. Gofynodd iddyn nhw pryd yn union naeth ei ddechrau gwella. A dyma nhw'n ateb, diflannodd y gres tua 1:00 pnawn ddoe. Sylweddolodd y tad, mae dyna'r union pryd ddywedodd Iesu wrtho, mae dy fab yn mynd i fyw. Felly aeth y dyn a phawb yn ei dŷ i gredu yn Iesu. Hon oedd yr ail wyrth naeth Iesu yn Galilea, fel arwydd o pwy oedd. Gwnaeth y wyrth ar ôl dod yn ôl o Judea i Galilea.
Jesus heals the official's son. After 2 days, he left for Galilee. Now Jesus himself had pointed out a prophet has no honour in his own country. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he'd done in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, for they had also been there. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he turned the water into wine, and there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. "Unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders," Jesus told him, "you will never believe." The royal official said, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Jesus replied, "You may go, your son will live." The man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on his way, his servants met him with news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, "The fever left him yesterday at the 7th hour." Then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." So he and all his household believed. This was the second miraculous sign that Jesus performed, having come from Judea to Galilee. Amen.
Dear Clive, thank you, Leslie, very much. So, a passage that may be fairly familiar to you, and that's what we're looking at very much closely today. I wonder what really came to your mind when you heard the passage, or when you hear it read out. I wonder what struck you. If you can go to slide number 3, please, Al. It's really funny when I prepared this and kind of prayed and was thinking about what to say and what I felt God was asking me to share this morning. The word authority kept on coming back to me. The word itself is not mentioned in the passage, but the passage speaks of the authority of God in Jesus and the great authority that he had. And I'd like to look at this kind of notion briefly from three different aspects about authority. Firstly, the authority as recognized by the official. I'll say a little bit more about who we think he was. Also talk about authority as demonstrated by Jesus in what he did and said and his presence. And also in terms of really reflecting authority and how we as individuals, as Christians and as communities respond and interact, if you like, with the authority of God in our lives, in our community. So let's start with the royal official. He wasn't just any official. He was royal, and he lived probably in Capernaum in the north. Just at that time, he was probably serving in the household. The only royalty in the north there was a guy called Herod Antipas, who was Herod the Great's son, one of the sons of Herod the Great, the nasty Herod, who had the children killed in Matthew's Gospel in the Christmas story. So he was probably linked to that household. So we don't know what we don't know about him. We don't know his nationality, and we don't know his religion as such. But we could guess that he had some rank. He was used to giving orders, and he was used to receiving orders too. He understood the chain of command. He was used to dealing with authority. We don't know what the official knew about Jesus. We don't know at this stage, no, except that clearly he had heard stories of this healer who had done miraculous things. Maybe rumours had been coming up from his royal connections in Jerusalem. We don't know. Maybe He was there at the Passover in Jerusalem that had just been celebrated, and where Jesus has caused quite a stir. We don't know that either, but we do know that he had heard of Jesus somehow. Of course, it was the authority that Jesus demonstrated that brought in his life both fame and landed him in deep trouble, of course. So I think this man of authority recognized in Jesus an authority. Something about him. Was it the miraculous signs? Was it his sense of presence? Was it the way that he taught? I'd like to look at briefly 3 ways in which Jesus demonstrated the authority as he acted on behalf of his Father, especially as portrayed by John in his Gospel very powerfully. So how did Jesus in his life demonstrate authority? It's a massive subject, and all I can do is give a few examples of the way Jesus demonstrated his authority, the authority that he exercised from God. First of all, Jesus demonstrated authority in what he said. And it wasn't just what he said, it's how he said it. I like to just read, well, I won't read it because I think I can remember most of it. But at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus has been teaching in Matthew chapter 7, and after all those times on the mountainside where Jesus spoke and taught, of course, Matthew records in his Gospel, well, what an impact. There was much discussion amongst the people because no one else spoke with the authority that he had. Jesus spoke with great authority, and that's another thing that started to rile the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, because they did not really speak with that authority. They based their teaching on, obviously, what we know as the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, the Psalms, the prophets. But for them, their faith had become dry. Jesus was animated, and he held about him an authority with the way that he spoke. What about showing authority in the things that he did? Well, of course, when he healed people, there's many ways in which he demonstrated that authority. And of course, the crowds gathered in ever-increasing numbers to see him heal and restore people. In fact, Jesus actually challenges the official in this passage, didn't he? You know, when he came to ask Jesus, "Oh, can you heal my son?" Jesus actually replied something slightly unusual. Almost slightly exasperated, Jesus replied, "Unless you see the miracles, you're not really going to believe, are you?" But it's interesting, the official's reply to that. He more or less said, and this is my own paraphrase, my belief is not based on the fact, my belief is based purely on the fact that I know you can do this. You have the authority to do this. I know you have. I know that you can save my son. It's not because of the hype around you. It's because I recognize something in you. I give orders, I receive them, and I know that you have authority over illness. You have authority over life itself. Because we know by the end of the story, the son did not die. And Jesus said, "Go, he's going to be okay." And of course, that's what happened. And so it took a man of authority to recognize this great authority Jesus had, his supernatural authority that he demonstrated. And I love that, the way it's rendered in John chapter 4, and give credit to the official. He did simply believe. Is our belief in Jesus simple? Do we take Jesus at his word? I know in my life I'm a little bit guilty of quibbling. Are you sure that's what you said? I'm not too happy with that request. But the beautiful simplicity of just believing and taking Jesus at his word. Nothing cluttered, just trust. And I find that a deep challenge to me. So we have authority in word. We have authority in deed, in the things that he did. And there's many more examples, not just in John's Gospel, but in the Gospels generally, of course, but his sheer presence. Have you known anyone where you're in their presence and they radiate presence? I've met many people like that. And as a teacher, having been a primary school teacher for a very long time, I did sort of toy with this idea. But what gives people in a classroom that air of authority? What is it about a person? They walk in the room and everything goes quiet. Now, it could be because of fear. You could be scared stiff of them. But I remember a couple of teachers I had as a boy in my secondary school. There was this short guy, geography teacher, Mr. Theka, and he was just a quiet man. He wasn't noisy. And as soon as he came in the room, the paper darts went away, there was a scrabble for order, and everything went quiet. And he wouldn't say much. He just stood there. And I don't know quite what it was about the man. I mean, my head teacher at my primary school, I can see Steve's cogwheels beginning to turn. Steve and I went to the same, my brother Steve and I went to the same primary school together, and the head teacher was the demon head teacher. He didn't have that sense of presence. Well, he did, but when you looked at him, partly because he was a very tall man, but he would look at you and you would just stop what you're doing. No, he was scary. I'm not first at all suggesting that Jesus is scary, but my point is that some people have a sense of presence about them. And I think this is very, very true of Jesus as he ministered. I don't know if you ever can reflect on this, what it must have been like to meet him face to face. Didn't he say somewhere that blessed are those who believe and have not seen these things, not seen me? I think we are here today through a great miracle. The fact that his presence continues to be real amongst us. And that is absolutely beautiful and wonderful. And he had that wonderful authoritative air. The people sat up and they listened. A bit hard to put your finger on it. Well, shall we put our finger on it? Where did that come from? There are people I know who are just basically charismatic. I'm not sure if that's the same thing. But what is it? Where did that authority come from? Jesus' authority, the way he demonstrated it in word and deed, and what his presence is what really caused a big stir among the religious leaders of his time. And of course, what was the repeat question to him? By whose authority are you doing this? They would only say that the authority would come directly with God, or was God behind it? Some people accused Jesus, of course, of drawing supernatural power from the dark side, the dark spirits. And I think the most wonderful thing is, certainly particularly in John's Gospel, what Jesus did, and what really challenges me, is that when he was challenged about this, and about how he explained what he did, and whose authority he was working under, it was from his Father. And in John's Gospel, why I like it particularly, is that lovely relationship that he wasn't just saying, my authority comes from God, or he did say that on occasion. He said, my authority comes from my Father. In Jesus, there was something alive, vibrant, life-giving. Was he just a carpenter from the north? Where does his authority come from? And I love that phrase, repeating phrase in John's Gospel. I and my Father are one. He who has seen me has seen the Father. So he ascribed all the authority that he had and held to the source, even though he was God himself. And this is where the theology gets complicated. He still attributed, although he was divine, fully God, he still attributed his power and his teaching to God alone. Where's all this going? John makes it clear, doesn't he, in his gospel, that as we look at Christ, we see God himself. I asked the question of myself and of us this morning, what do people see when they look at us as Christians? Do they see a charismatic person, a lovely person, a person of authority? What I must learn to do is deflect that always back to God. It is he that lives in us. It is he who transforms. It is he who does the work. How is God's authority made manifest in us? The miracle of redemption, of course, is that God still imparts to us his authority to speak, his authority to heal, his authority to stand firm in a dark world, to love through his Holy Spirit. I need to say what authority is not. When we think of the word authority, we think sometimes of people in authority who are not good. So authority is not lording it over people. Authority is not being heavy-handed or throwing our weight around. In fact, I think the root of authority is linked very, very closely to humility. If we are to experience that authority in our lives, then we need to humble ourselves before God and let him do in us what he will. This thing about the transference of authority, it happened to me at school in terms of on whose authority I was teaching. I know we call them local educational authorities. All the teachers groan amongst us. But when I was a deputy head in Manchester, my head teacher became poorly. She was quite poorly for a year and a half, 2 years, and so they wanted me to act as the head. And so they came to me and said, James, we know that Mrs. Johnson's not well. We'd like you to take on that mantle of authority. The authority I was given was not because I was who I was or the kind of teacher I was. My position meant that the authority was given to me by the education authority. I didn't act on my own behalf. I acted on behalf of the education authority. And I was also answerable to the authority. I was simply passing on that authority as I managed the school. If we are to receive the gift of authority in our lives, we must remember this. This transference of authority is a channeling, humbly, the gift of God in us. Authority in our hearts and lives as individuals and communities is really as we accept humbly the authority of God in our lives. Sometimes that is very painful. Isn't it wonderful to celebrate all that Jesus has achieved for us? But there's a calling to serve him, and there's this great promise that we can act on his behalf and we can do these things and greater. Jesus did say that, and he authorizes us here and now to take his word and love into the world. But we have to stay close. We have to be humble. We have to listen. And I want to end this little bit with a reflection. when I became a Christian, I happened to go to an Anglican church, Church of England in Kent, in south of England. And I was given this book. Someone has already said, I've seen that book before. I don't know if you've come across it, Prayers of Life by Michel Cois. He's a very gifted writer, a French guy. He wrote this in the 1960s. But this has always really struck me as being a very, very challenging bit of writing. You see, God needs us to say yes to him. And this is what he wrote, and it's called Help Me to Say Yes. I'm afraid of saying, yes, Lord, where will you take me? I'm afraid of drawing the longest straw, and I'm afraid of signing my name to an unread agreement. I'm afraid of saying yes that entails other yeses. Yet I'm not at peace. You pursue me, Lord, you besiege me. I run after noise for fear of hearing you, but in a moment of silence you slip through. I turn from the road, for I've caught sight of you, but at the end of the path you are there waiting for me. Where shall I hide? I meet you everywhere. Is it then impossible to escape you? But I am actually afraid to say, yes, Lord. I'm afraid of putting my hand in yours, for you hold on to it. I'm afraid of meeting your eyes, for you can win me. I'm afraid of your demands, for you are a jealous God. I'm hemmed in, yet I hide. I'm captured, yet I struggle. I fight knowing I'm defeated, for you are stronger, Lord. You own the world, and you take it from me. And when I stretch out my hand to catch hold of people and things, they vanish before me. It's no fun. I can't keep anything for myself. The flower I pick fades in my hands. My laugh freezes on my lips. The waltz I dance leaves me restless and uneasy. Everything's empty. It seems hollow. You've made a desert around me. I'm hungry and I'm thirsty, and the whole world cannot satisfy me. Yet I loved you, Lord. What have I done to you? I worked for you. I gave myself for you. Great and terrible God, what more do you want? Son, I want more for you and for the world. Until now you have planned your actions, and I have no need of them. You've asked for my approval, you have asked for my support. You wanted to interest me in your work. But don't you see, son, that you're reversing the roles? I have watched you. I've seen your goodwill. I want more than you now. You will no longer do your own works, but the will of your Father in heaven. Say yes, son. I need your yes as I needed Mary's yes to come to earth. For it is I who must do your work. It is I who must live in your family. It is I who must be in your neighborhood and not you, for it is my look that penetrates and not yours. It's my words that carry weight and not yours. My life transforms and not yours. Give all to me, abandon all to me. I need your yes to be united to you and to come down to earth. I need your yes to continue saving the world. Lord, I am afraid of your demands, but who can resist you? That your kingdom come and not mine, that your will may be done and not mine. Help me to say yes. What I'd like to do now, just briefly, is to draw your attention to some questions for reflection. And they're on the screen. While you think about them and perhaps pray quietly, I'll play a bit of music in the background, so you have a listen to the music as well. What do I understand to be the place of God's authority in my life and in the life of Christian community? How is God's authority made manifest in me and in our community? When people see me and us, who do they see? And what does it mean to hide myself in you? What does it mean to hide myself in Christ? Have a think.